Hattie, it's me. Lecture number 1. Okay, so just as a reminder, the quizzes, which can be accessed here, let me show you where they are. Let me sign in as student, view as student. All right, remember, always go to content first. That's the easiest thing to do. Right there on the top, let's see, top left, content, that's what I just clicked on. It usually defaults to bookmarks, table of contents. I don't know what it defaults to now. This layout looks different. Anyway, it went to final paper assignment because that's the last thing I did. But that's not where we want to go anyway. What we want to do is you want to go to activities. Then to go to the quizzes, guess what? After you hit activities, go to where it says quizzes. Now, what it says for me right now is there are currently no quizzes available because they'll only show up when you're allowed to take them. That's because I'm signed in as student right now. So let me show you what it looks like if you're signed in as professor. Oh crap, I accidentally logged out of the whole dang thing. Let's see, verify. Okay, I'm back in. Activities, quizzes. Oh, that's Melanie and me when we were dating. Somehow the screen went away. That's the plus and minus of the touch screen. All right, you can see right there, quiz number 1, abandoned book and vocabulary. All right, so go to activities and quizzes when you feel like you're ready to take the quiz. And of course, you've got the separate video on how the quizzes work to explain to you how much time you have and how they're organized and stuff like that. But what I want to emphasize right now is that the quizzes are only over the reading that was assigned for that week, all right? Which for this week is vocabulary and abandoned book, which I'll explain here in just a moment. But so that's all the quizzes are over. However, there's also lecture and 2 things. The lecture is over the reading, and I know what's on the quiz. So I'm not exactly going to like lay out every single thing on the quiz for you from the reading, but I am going to make sure that I emphasize the things that'll be the most helpful to you in taking the quiz. So once again, to emphasize my point here, the quizzes are reading only. You don't need to remember anything from the lecture, except that the lecture's over the reading, right? So I mean, so the lecture is meant to help you with your reading that you then use to take the quiz, right? The very first thing we got to do in here is to lay out some vocabulary. Oh, and sorry about the shade. I'm like half in darkness, but it works out better for you to be able to see the screen over here. The first thing we need to do is to go over some vocabulary. And so a couple years ago, I actually sat down and typed it all up, and then I revised it a bit for this semester. So we've got a list here, but I want to go through it for you to make sure that you understand it. And the very first thing I want to talk about is actually the very first thing I talk about in any course that I teach, and that is the difference between validity and cogency. And in order to think about this, what we want to start is we want to start with what is an argument. Right, an argument is a series of premises that lead to a conclusion. For example, let's see, I don't want to use the same one I had there. John Harvey is German. Premise 2. All Germans eat strudel. Therefore, all right, so first premise, John Harvey is German. Second premise, premise number 2, all Germans eat strudel. Therefore, think about it, what's the conclusion? John Harvey eats strudel. All right. Validity. Validity is the quality of an argument that the premises are, that the conclusion is completely supported by the premises. If the conclusion is completely supported by the premises, the argument is valid, all right? This argument is valid. John Harvey is German, all Germans eat strudel, John Harvey eats strudel. Perfectly valid conclusion. This conclusion here, the 3 dots means therefore, this conclusion is completely supported by those 2 premises. If that's true and that's true, that's got to be true. That's got to be true. That's validity, all right, validity. Now, almost every argument, almost every model, almost every theory you will ever come across in the discipline of economics is valid. Economists, whether they be Marxists, Austrians, neoclassicals, feminists, post-Keynesians, institutionalists, new institutionalists, they're all really, really careful about validity. I wonder where I put my pen. There it is. They're really careful about validity. Economists are really careful about making sure that any conclusions they come to are supported by the assumptions they had made before. All right. Now, obviously, it gets a lot more complicated in real life, and you might have like several layers going on here where these 2 premises lead to this conclusion, and then this conclusion becomes a premise of the next argument, and so forth. But it's one of the reasons why economists use so much math, is because it's so easy to show whether or not something is valid or not. Because if the math doesn't work, it's not valid. All right? If the math doesn't work, it's not valid. So almost every argument you will ever come across, whether it be from Karl Marx or Adam Smith, is going to be valid. We're really careful about that. I also want to point out that validity is relatively objective, all right? That it doesn't matter what religion you are, what your politics are, where you were born, what's your favorite football team, whatever, you're still going to agree that if premise 1 holds and premise 2 holds, then the conclusion is going to hold, all right? Doesn't matter about your belief system, whether or not you believe this and this lead to this, all right? Whether or not you believe this is supported by that. Validity, relatively objective, which is why it's not all that important. Well, I mean, I say that. I mean, it's the easy test to pass. It's the easy test to pass. The tough one is cogency. All right. Cogency requires both validity and that the premises be warranted. I'm going to write that down here, warranted. Or reasonable. Let's see if you can see that. Yeah, that the premises be warranted or reasonable. Now, notice I didn't say true. I didn't say true. True is an awful tough thing to hold anything to. There are very few things, if we're going to be serious scientists, there are very few things we're going to say, oh, that's true. We're going to say instead, we're going to be careful because scientists are supposed to be skeptical. We're going to say instead that there is a great deal of support for that position. All right. And I don't know, the theory of gravity, you know, is it true? Well, we have a lot of support for it. We have a great deal we have so much support that we treat it as almost true, but we would never say true because we're good scientists, right? And we always want to be skeptical. So we're going to say there's a great deal of support, right? So maybe the first human to ever see a dolphin would say, well, look at that fish. Well, that's not unwarranted. Given how much knowledge we have of the planet at that point, then it's not unwarranted to call a dolphin a fish. But as we learn more about it and as we started coming up with various definitions of what a fish is versus what a mammal is and so forth, so, oh, well, actually, a dolphin is a mammal. How about that? All right, so let's look back to this and think about, let me turn the page here on my reading. Yeah. Let's look back here and have a look at this and say, okay, all I got to do is check citizenship on this one right here, right? I'm not German. I'm not German. I actually have three passports. I was born in England, but I have U.S. citizenship through my dad because he was in the Air Force at the time. And I also have Irish citizenship through my grandfather, who was Irish. I filled out all the forms and stuff. So I'm I'm Irish, English, and American, but I ain't German, all right? So that is not a warranted premise, all right? That's not a warranted premise. Sometimes it's easy to tell. What about the second one? There's probably some joker, there's probably somebody named Hans in Hamburg who's like, ach du liebe, ich habe das Strudel nicht sehr gern. Pardon me. I don't like strudel, right? And so they're not real good premises here. They're not real solid premises. So we're going to say that's probably not a cogent argument. It's valid. It's valid. It's absolutely valid. But it's not cogent. And by the way, an argument must be valid before we bother to test it for cogency. What would be the point of testing this? John Harvey is Italian. All Germans eat strudel. Why doesn't it make any sense to start with? I mean, we're not going to come up with a conclusion. Why would we go through the trouble of testing whether or not a premise is warranted if the argument isn't valid in the first place? So cogent requires validity plus the premises are warranted. All right, here's the problem. This one is much more subjective, right? The example I picked out was pretty straightforward. I have one in the book, I'm sorry, in the reading, and I'd forgotten I had done this. I kind of liked it until I reread it a while ago. Premise 1, unemployed people are lazy. Unemployed people are lazy. Premise 2, Pat is unemployed. Therefore, Pat is lazy. Valid argument? Absolutely. Absolutely. Cogent argument. Well, let's start with the easy one. Let's check and see if Pat has a job. All right, so that's going to be real easy to check, and let's say Pat doesn't. Okay, that one seems to hold up. Are unemployed people lazy? Well, some of them are, surely. And we've also got voluntary and involuntary unemployment. My parents are voluntarily unemployed because they are in their 80s. What about involuntarily unemployed people? Well, some of them I'm sure are lazy and some of them I'm sure are not, right? It becomes really hard to try to come up with a definitive decision on the premises, particularly when every model is wrong. When we model the real world, we by definition simplify the real world. Hey, let's say that this past summer you got in touch with an old high school friend. And you said, what have you been doing? And your high school friend says, well, I've been building a model B-17 bomber from World War II. It's 1-to-1 scale and it drops bombs. And you're like, well, you're not building a model B-17, you're just building a B-17. A model B-17 simplifies some aspect of the real thing. A model is a simplification, all right? A model is a simplification. We have to build models of the economy. The real world economy is way too complex, and so consequently, we can always criticize a model for, you know what, that's actually not quite right. Well, yeah, I know it's not. I mean, I'm trying to get as close as I can, and so for it to still be useful. And that becomes the rule of thumb, by the way. I've got it jotted down here somewhere. Let's see. The question for cogency is not whether or not the premise is true, but whether or not it is warranted. And in this context, think of warranted as close enough to allow the model to generate useful insights, Now, this is a value judgment, all right? We have models in economics that assume that only firms borrow money, not consumers. We know that's not true. But actually, for the purposes of that model, the results are not bad. They give us the insights we want to have. We have to narrow things down and see what kind of insights we can get from the model. So it's an art. It's something of an art. The validity part, that's a science, all right? It's pretty objective. You know, whether or not these premises lead to that conclusion is fairly straightforward. But the problem with cogency is that that in building our models, you can always criticize, that's not quite right. That's not quite right. That's not quite right. I know it's not quite right. We had to make simplifying assumptions because the real world is too complicated, and we had to narrow it down to something simpler. So my real question is it so oversimplified that we're unable to get any useful insights about the real world? And that's possible. We still got something out of that. So yeah, I mean, that might not be the be-all and end-all of all models, but it's a start. John Maynard Keynes, one of my heroes. By the way, as you'll learn here a little bit later in this video, Keynes and Keynesian are not the same thing. They're different schools of thought, which is a pain in the neck, isn't it? But John Maynard Keynes said that we should not expect economic models to spit out like these clear, definitive answers. Economics is a way of thinking through problems and trying to analyze what the different factors are, and a way to organize your thoughts. And speaking of a way to organize your thoughts, the second topic in your vocabulary handout is fallacy of composition. And write that down here. Fallacy of composition. Fallacy of composition. And that looks legible. All right. I'm a macro person. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm really interested in the whole economy at once, in unemployment, inflation, interest rates, GDP growth. I'm not as interested in microeconomics. Now, I mean, obviously, since I became an economist, I probably have a much greater interest than the average person does. But microeconomics is like the economics of the individual consumer, the individual firm, that sort of thing. I like the big picture. And one of the things you learn as a macroeconomist, hopefully, is to be really careful of this right here. The fallacy of composition is when you assume that what is true of an individual unit in some whole is also true of the whole. For example, let's say that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use the same example as is in the handout there, but I've been using it for years. Let's say you said to somebody, if only the Texas Rangers could improve their pitching, they would win more games. Is that a reasonable statement? Well, I mean, everything else held equal. If nothing else in Major League Baseball changes except the Rangers have better pitching, then there's no reason not to expect that to come true, right? All right, so that's the individual unit. Now imagine if you expanded that to all of Major League Baseball, and you say, after 3 or 4 beers, you get to think, actually, if every team in Major League Baseball improved their pitching, I'll bet every team could win more games. Obviously not. Because ever since Abner Doubleday invented baseball, back in the 1800s, I think, after the Civil War, the average winning percentage in baseball has always been 500. For every win, there's a loss. What does the average team in baseball, what is its winning percentage? 500. There's no ties in baseball, so there's always going to be exactly as many W's as many L's. So no, that's not true. If every team in Major League Baseball improved their pitching, then the average winning percentage would still be 500. You can't make that assumption, right? So that is the fallacy of composition. Now, not that you cannot have situations where it's true at the individual level and at the higher level. Let's see. If you studied harder for this class, you could make a higher grade. Okay. If everybody in this class studied harder, everybody could make a higher grade. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't have a rule in my class to where there has to be this number of A's and this number of B's and so forth. So yeah, everybody could do better, all right? So the fallacy of composition is something to watch out for, especially because it's not always true. Sometimes you can generalize on the experience of an individual unit to the whole unit. You can't with baseball because there's only a set number of wins every year, all right? It's 162 times half of the teams. And so that's going to be how many wins there are. But, I'm sorry, and in economics, all right? Let's give you an economics example. If I save more money this year, by the end of the year, I'll be wealthier. Well, that's probably true, right? If everybody in the macroeconomy saved more money this year, we'd all be wealthier. No, the economy would crash. If nobody was spending any money, if we were all saving, then we'd all end up not as well off as we were to start with. Got to be careful about that. Got to be careful about transferring personal experience to the entire macroeconomy. Or another one that's going to come up later around week 10, I think, something like that. All right. When the U.S. government has a budget deficit, who has the surplus? For every deficit, there's a surplus. Somebody's got to have a surplus. We've got to look into that in week 10. We've got to say, wait a minute. If the government's going further into debt, who is it that's accumulating assets? And spoiler, it's you and me. We'll get to that later. All right. Now, the next topic, the third topic in the vocabulary handout, is the difference between physical and financial capital. Unfortunately, these words are used not only in economics classes, but in general conversation. And the way they're used in general conversation is typically not the way we use the word in economics class. And so that creates a problem here for understanding what's going on in the class. Generally speaking, we've got financial and physical. We've got financial capital and physical capital. We've got financial investment and physical investment. Usually, in everyday conversation, people are talking about financial. We only talk about that now and then. We usually mean physical. Here's the difference, right? Physical capital is, well, here, I'll draw you a picture. There's a factory, all right? Physical capital is anything a firm uses to produce its output, but which does not become part of its output. So like if you go to a restaurant, then the building you're sitting in is part of that restaurant's physical capital. The silverware, assuming it's metal and not plastic, is part of their physical capital, right? The plates that they give you, assuming they're not paper plates, is physical capital for them, right? But the chicken fajita you ate, the chicken they used, the spices they used and so forth, that became part of what they sold to you. That is not physical capital. Physical capital is stuff they use to produce their output. I mean, the cash register they use, or the thing that come out when they take your credit card, that's physical capital. Now, notice that physical capital can wear out. Like the silverware gets beat up and stuff like that, and they got to replace it. Or the napkins, let's say they got cloth napkins, then they get torn up and stuff. They got to replace those, but they're still physical capital because they're not part of what you took home with you, unless you are a thief, right? Now, if it's like a fast food place and they got plasticware, well then that's part of what they sold to you. They don't expect you to give the plasticware back. Or paper napkins, that's part of what they sold to you. They don't expect to get that back. That's not physical capital. Physical capital is anything they use to produce their output. TCU. That's part of our physical capital right there. Now, do these wear out? Absolutely they do. A lot faster than, say, the computers or the whiteboards and stuff like that. This is my personal property now, but it was at one point in my office. Econ used to be in a trailer, and for about 10 years. And so this was in my office. And then when they were tearing the trailer down and moving us to permanent facilities, they said you can keep your whiteboard if you want to. So I did. So this whiteboard would have lasted for decades. Had we still kept those same offices, it would have lasted for decades. It's part of our physical capital. These pens, part of our physical capital. Right? So physical capital, the easiest way to do this in class is to always imagine we're talking about a factory. All right, that's a very narrow definition, but you'll never go wrong with it. You'll never go wrong. I'm not going to be like, so that'll be a good way to think of it. Anything that they use to produce their output, but you don't take with you as the customer, is physical capital. What about financial capital? Well, now these are financial assets. These are, I like the way I worded that in here. Let's see here. Refers to any asset used to defer current consumption to the future, all right? It's a way of saving. A financial capital is a way of saving. That's saving your income. And it could be bonds, it could be Princess Diana collectible plates, it could be whatever it is that the assets that you like to invest in to save for the future. Now, notice that they're very, very different. And it's unfortunate, speaking as an economist, it's unfortunate that those meanings have become, that we use the same word for two very distinct processes. I mean, they can be related, like a company could sell stock, which somebody then uses as a financial asset, as a financial capital. They could sell stock to build a factory, but otherwise these are very different concepts. And so when we are talking about these concepts in class, they're going to be very different lectures. There's going to be a lecture about that, there's going to be a lecture about that. But we're not really going to link the two together because they're very distinct. I mean, there are circumstances under which they might be related, but usually not. Usually not. Now, that's financial capital is a form of saving, like your stocks and bonds and cash, whereas physical capital is, as I said, anything a firm uses to produce its output, which doesn't become part of its output. What about investment? Well, investment is the process of adding to capital. So when they are, I don't know if I can do this or not, I'm not good at art. Look, that's a half-built factory, okay? So they've got the smokestacks up, but that's it. They're still working on the rest of it. They're building the factory. While they're building the factory, that's called physical investment. Physical investment is the process of adding to physical capital. Once they're done, they'll call it physical capital. But while they're building it, it's physical investment. And then likewise, when you are, I'm going to write down here, when you're buying assets that you're going to use for saving, when you're buying them, the process of buying them is investment. And then once you own them, it's part of your, so that's financial investment. This is financial capital. Again, we're not really very careful about differentiating among these things when just everyday conversation. And I have to tell you, and it mentions this in the handout, when I have gone and observed younger faculty's lectures, sometimes I can see them confusing the heck out of the class because when you're a new professor, you know in your head which one you mean, but you haven't gotten used to being really careful yet about differentiating and being specific to a classroom full of people who have heard these words all over the place and used for different things and used as synonyms when they're not really, well, I guess they are synonyms in that context, but not in our classroom. They're not. They're very different. So I'm going to try to be very careful about this when I talk about these concepts in class. And let's see, I believe, the last thing I had there was a bit about an analogy that if you want to think of capital as the water in a bathtub and investment as the faucet pouring water in, so the pouring water in is investment, and that's true whether it's physical or financial. The pouring water in is investment. The water level is capital, so once the water has gone into the tub and is leveled off with everything else, well then it's part of the capital. And now we can even add in the drain, which would be disinvestment, which would be like when the factory wears out, then that's disinvestment, or when you sell some of your financial assets, that's disinvestment, stuff like that. Okay, so we're about 29 minutes, almost 30 minutes in. That is the vocabulary handout. I also assigned, I called it abandoned volume, all right? I called it abandoned volume. I don't have it uploaded yet, so I can't show it to you on there. I'm going to have everything organized by module, which I'm sure I've already told you in another video. This was a book I started, and the date is on there. You can see October 18th, 2015, so it was like a decade ago. A book I started writing that never finished. I ended up writing a different book instead. And I thought that this would give you, I think it's really important to have a sense of where your instructor is coming from, and also a sort of broader context of the economics discipline. So what this talks about is, All right. I've just highlighted a couple of things here. One of the things I said is early on in that book, I said, you might be thinking of skipping over the chapters about economics because, I already know economics. I'm going to jump right to the conclusions. And I point out there's two reasons why you shouldn't do that. Even if you already have an economics background, it's not a good idea to try to skip ahead. Now, you can't because this is all locked in module by module, but what I'm about to say is very important to understanding the rest of the course. All right, the first thing I said was about why you shouldn't skip these chapters is that fallacy of composition, which I've erased now, fallacy of composition, that people exist as individual units in the macroeconomy, and they often assume that what's true for them is true for the macroeconomy as a whole, this way, which is not necessarily true, right? So there's a fallacy of composition. But you already know that. I've already talked about fallacy of composition. It goes through some examples. The other thing I talk about, and this is important to the rest of the class, is that the other problem is that mainstream macroeconomics has a lot of problems. Here's something that didn't even exist back when I wrote this chapter. A fella named, oh good Lord, I can picture the guy, Paul Romer. He won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he also wrote an article called The Trouble with Macroeconomics, and that's what we're mainly doing in this class is macro, unemployment, inflation, that sort of thing. Again, I apologize for the weird shadows, but it works out better to see the screen. He said that macroeconomics had gone backwards for 30 years, that it's done extremely poorly. And what I explain in this chapter is that economists tend to try to impress other economists. That's what causes you to move up in the ranking of how good you are, is how much you've impressed other economists. Not so much how much you've lowered unemployment, how much you've pleased the average consumer and so forth. Those don't have to be unrelated, but largely they are, and they become more so. I was trying to decide where to work this example in. No, let me tell you a little bit more. People say that economists, and when I say economists, I mean mainstream economics. I'm giving you the economics of a different school of thought. I'm giving you the economics of post-Keynesianism and institutionalism. You don't need to remember that, but it would be useful for you to know that I'm not giving you the mainstream view on most stuff. I'm giving you an alternate view that comes from John Maynard Keynes, who is not Keynesian, as it turns out, and from a fellow named Thorstein Veblen, who lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, died right before the Great Depression. And so, mainstream economics, people say it has physics envy. It wishes it were physics, and so it wants to do all kinds of advanced mathematics, whether it's relatively relevant or not. Now, I was a physics major. That was my first major, and I just was I thought I wanted to be an astronaut, and I thought the route to astronaut was physics, and it's not really anyway. So I took physics. It's not what I thought it was going to be. So it's all discussed in here. But economics has this physics envy, and let me read to you something that you can read for yourself later. But I really want you to hear this. This is from the economics department at California State University East Bay. And they posted this to their students who might be considering graduate school in economics. Preparing to enter a PhD program in economics requires a lot of time. The courses you need to take are likely to surprise you. If you are contemplating a PhD in economics, chances are that you've taken some economics courses already, that you have enjoyed them and performed well in them. It is natural to assume that this is sufficient to obtain admission to a PhD program. That is, that if you major in economics with a high GPA, one might naturally assume this will earn you admission into a solid PhD program. Nothing could be further from the truth, is the next thing they say. And I'm going to say it again. Nothing could be further from the truth. That if you majored in economics, you had a high GPA, this ought to get me, into... So let me finish. The fact is that competition for a limited number of PhD spots is fiercer than ever, and that without extensive coursework and a high level of performance in mathematics, you're not going to get in. The level of mathematical preparation required for entrance into a PhD program is considerably higher than it was for some of your professors. Is there any other discipline where this is true? Are they telling people who are majoring in English, now by the way, doing really well in English classes, that's not going to get you into English. What you really need to know also is biology. Well, no, they're not saying that. Or in biology. You're doing really well in biology. You've got a 3.9 in all your biology classes. You're one of the best students. But honestly, you really need to know some journalism to get into biology, PhD biology program. They're not going to say that. We do. It is not uncommon to see people major in economics, get a PhD in economics who never took economics as an undergrad, that they instead took mathematics and statistics. By the way, this university took this quote down, took this thing down. I was quoting it all over the place, and I think they must have found out and felt kind of embarrassed because I was not quoting it in a positive way. Now, this has been evolving for a long time. I've got some more evidence in here. I'm not going to go through all this because that's why I gave you the reading. But I do want to tell you this. Okay, here's a good quote from another fellow. I am going to read you this. James K. Galbraith down at the University of Texas. He argues that economists have become preoccupied with their own puzzles. Most of them are not interested in macroeconomics. Most of them are not interested in economic policy questions. Just last week in the econ department, we had a fellow come in, present a paper, mainstream economist, about AI and its effect on the labor market. I want you to think to yourself what kind of concerns you would have if you're, in an area where AI might be able to work. What would be your concern? I asked my class this the day after this person presented. Hey, we just had a talk from this guy talking about AI and labor. If you were working in one of these places, what would you be worried about? And one of my students said, losing my job? I said, yeah, I think so. I think that'd be your big concern. You are not going to believe me. He assumed away unemployment. The guy presenting the paper assumed away the possibility that somebody would lose their job and not find another one very quickly, or not find another one, right? This is typical of mainstream economics, that they assume that the economy automatically fixes itself. So, in his paper, which was highly mathematical, in his paper on the impact of AI on labor, the question of what will it do to unemployment was never asked. He said twice, we're going to assume that everyone, ends up with a job. We're not going to introduce any frictions into the model so that there's unemployment. There's no unemployment. Well, if there's no unemployment, then what the heck are we worried about? All right, so in fact, what the conclusion of the paper was that there might be a short-term cost to the people who are displaced by AI, but in the long run, since AI will increase our productivity in our society, we're all going to be better off. So, but they assumed away the big problem that people are worried about, and I just don't get it. I just don't get it. So I have, as you'll read here, I became kind of distressed with my economics education and thought, well, this doesn't make sense to me. So now, this doesn't mean that there are no useful things coming out of mainstream economics. I have a book that I've written on different schools of thought in economics. In fact, there's a chapter you'll have to read near the end of the semester. And there's not a single school of thought from which I haven't learned something interesting. There's not a single one where I haven't thought to myself, well, I never thought of it that way before. That's kind of neat. That's a good way of thinking about that. But there's also things that I don't think make sense. All right, so not trashing the whole area, but I'm not taking their approach because to me it's much more important to try to solve real world problems. All right. Speaking of which, what is my view? There's an economist named Gunnar Myrdal who said there's no such thing as a view except from a viewpoint. Now, if you've had some economics before, you might have heard them talk about positive versus normative economics. They talk about that in mainstream economics classes, in what called neoclassicism, economics classes. They say this is value free and this is a value judgment. school of thought that I come from says there's no such thing as value free. It doesn't exist. The very choice of what to study is a value judgment. The very choice of how to study it is a value judgment. Marxists study class. Why do you think they study class? Class, labor versus capital. They've already got in mind what they think is right and wrong. Neoclassical study the individual. Austrians do the individual. Now, are there relative degrees? Yeah. But I mean, you know, okay, the Cowboys just won 24-21, I believe, against the Eagles, and came back and won it in overtime. I can give you the Cowboy Eagle score. It's 24-21. Is that value free? Well, kind of, except I'm also expressing the fact that I find National Football League interesting, all right? So, but that's not, that's relatively close to positive economics, right? I mean, it's relatively value-free, but it's not completely value-free. And so, from my school of thought, they say the important thing is to recognize that there's no such thing as a value-free judgment, and just admit it. Because when you admit it, now you can work harder to fight against it. But when you deny it, then all of your value judgments are still coming through, but you're pretending they're not. All right, so that's kind of the last part of this abandoned book chapter, and I believe that's all I had outlined here that I wanted you to see. Yeah, you can figure that one out yourself. One more thing. I feel like Columbo. One more thing, and that is, I said Keynes and Keynesian are not the same thing. Keynesian is a branch of the mainstream of economics. It is a branch of mainstream economics. And the big difference, the easiest difference between the two is that Keynesian economics believes that the economy can fix itself, but there are some things in the way that get in the way, like human-made factors, like minimum wage laws or contracts. These interfere with the ability of the economy to do what it would naturally do, and that is automatically go back to full employment, which means everyone who wants a job has a job. Keynes says you can take out all the frictions you want. The system itself is still unstable. The system itself is still unstable. And so, now does that make him anti-capitalist? Well, A, I don't care whether it makes him anti-capitalist or not, because as you'll see at the end of the chapter, I'm more concerned about pragmatism and about, I want to take as much of the ideology out of the question as possible. Does it work or not? I mean, if capitalism works, that's great. Then we keep it. If it doesn't, then get rid of it, all right? But none of these pseudo-religious attachments to specific economic systems, it makes no sense. It makes no logical sense. I've heard people describe themselves as pro-market. I was like, what does that even mean? It'd be like a carpenter saying, I'm pro-hammer. Well, yeah, I'm pro-hammer too when I have a nail to drive into a piece of wood. But when my problem is I have a big piece of wood to make into small pieces of wood, I'm pro-saw. So I change what I'm pro depending on what the problem is at hand. Anyway, Keynes, powered flight is unstable. That plane wants to be on the ground. It's trying really, really hard to be on the ground, all right? But we find so many advantages to powered flight that we have tried to figure out ways of engineering planes to where they don't end up on the ground except when we mean them to. So Keynes was kind of the same way. It's like, no, the capitalist system's unstable, but we need to find a way to stabilize it, all right? So because there's advantages to having it, but not everywhere, as we'll talk about later. All right, I think that's it for your first lecture. 43 minutes and 31 seconds. May the force be with you.